Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you may be joining us from. Today's webinar is the third of our series of clinical trial webinars, and we're happy to have you joining us today. As you know, there are many clinical trials currently enrolling PWS patients for their studies. Some of these trials are investigational drugs, others are behavioral interventions. An overview of PWS clinical trials are available on fpwr.org. And I encourage you to visit the site to learn more about the opportunities that are available. We are so fortunate to have these opportunities available to us. A few years ago, there were few trial opportunities for people with PWS. This year alone, we will require more than 500 patients to fill these trials. I know you're joining us today because you want treatments for your loved one, and these trials are the first step. In order to bring any treatment to market, we need to enroll these trials so that they can collect the data necessary to show efficacy for the FDA. It will require the effort of the entire PWS community to help complete these trials, and I encourage you to learn more about these opportunities, discuss them with your physicians, and determine if an opportunity may be right for you and your loved one with PWS. Today's guest presenter is from Levo Therapeutics, and Davis Ryman will be sharing more information with you regarding their phase 3 study of Carbetocin. We will be collecting questions from the audience throughout the webinar, and we'll answer all of your questions after the short presentation. Without further delay, I give you Davis Ryman from Levo.
Okay, thanks very much, Susan, and thank you to SPWR for inviting us to give this informational webinar on our phase 3 study, which is now enrolling patients, and it's evaluating an investigational medication called intranasal Carbetocin, also called LV-101, as a potential treatment for hyperphagia, compulsive and obsessive symptoms, and anxiety in people with PWS. So the study is called CARE-PWS, which stands for the Carbetocin Efficacy and Safety Study in Prader-Willi syndrome, if you want to spell it out. This, as purposes of disclosure, I am an employee of Levo Therapeutics. And if we go to the next slide, we'll start by giving you a brief overview of what Carbetocin is and what some of the key reasons are that support evaluating it as a potential treatment for PWS. In the coming slides, I'll then briefly review some of the available information on the safety and effectiveness of Carbetocin. So this comes from a phase 2 study of Carbetocin in PWS patients that was completed in 2014 and was published last year. And then lastly, to close out the webinar, I'll discuss the design of the phase 3 study, the CARE-PWS study that's currently ongoing in the United States and Canada. And I'll review a map of the planned study sites and some of the travel arrangements for those who could be interested in enrolling this study. And so then we'll leave plenty of time, as Susan said, for questions from the audience at the end. Okay. So in this current slide, I'll give a brief overview of what Carbetocin is. This is the experimental medication that's being evaluated in our phase 3 CARE-PWS study, and I'll explain some of the key reasons that motivate the continued investigation of this as a potential treatment for PWS. So what is Carbetocin? It's what's called an oxytocin analog, meaning that it's a synthetic molecule that's been designed to be very similar to the natural hormone called oxytocin. So oxytocin itself is a natural hormone that's present in humans and all other mammals, and it's normally produced mainly in an area of the brain called the hypothalamus. And oxytocin has multiple important functions in the normal human body, including the control of appetite, social and emotional behaviors, and anxiety. So Carbetocin was designed to be very similar to oxytocin, but it has several important differences that I can point out here. So compared to oxytocin itself, Carbetocin actually binds to the oxytocin receptors in the body, which with much greater specificity. So this means it shows less what's called off-target binding to other different receptor types in the body, such as vasopressin receptors. And it binds very specifically to the oxytocin receptors, primarily more than even oxytocin itself does. So because of this greater specificity, we're hopeful that this may result in less potential for side effects than could be encountered with oxytocin itself. One other difference just to mention and point out is that carbetocin has a somewhat longer half-life than oxytocin. This means it remains present in the body for somewhat longer following each dose than oxytocin itself would, and so might have potentially a slightly longer lasting effect following each dose. So why is it that we are thinking or focusing on the potential for carbetocin in treating PWS symptoms? One of the most important reasons is that it's been shown that individuals with PWS have a significantly decreased number of oxytocin-producing neurons or nerve cells in their brain. So considering this fact, along with the known important roles of oxytocin that I was discussing a moment ago, such as control of appetite and social and emotional behaviors, considering that, we're hopeful that the use of carbetocin to try to replace this deficiency in oxytocin function in PWS patients might be a helpful therapeutic strategy to try to address some of the key symptoms of PWS, potentially including both hyperphagia as well as obsessive and compulsive symptoms and perhaps anxiety. So lastly on this slide, one interesting fact about the previous clinical experience with carbetocin is that actually an intravenous or IV form of carbetocin is currently approved by regulatory agencies in over 90 countries outside the US for a very different use than PWS. So in that setting, it's used for preventing excessive bleeding following a cesarean delivery. So it's estimated that in the history of use for that different reason, it's estimated that over 10 million women have received intravenous carbetocin with no significant safety concerns noted to date. So that's very encouraging that there's that history of prior use. But of course, because an IV medication really isn't well suited for considering chronic treatment of PWS patients, the development of an intranasal formulation of carbetocin was initiated by Ferring Pharmaceuticals. So this is a nasal spray. You can see an example of how the nasal spray device might look like to the right, and is delivered 3 times a day before meals by a nasal spray into the nose. So a phase 2 study of this intranasal form of carbetocin in PWS was completed in 2014, and we'll present a summary of the safety and effectiveness results from that study in the coming slides. Okay, Susan, if we could advance the slide. Thank you. So as I previously mentioned, this phase 2 study was completed by Ferring Pharmaceuticals in 2014, and it involved 14 days of treatment with either intranasal carbetocin or a matching placebo, an inactive nasal spray, in a total of 37 participants with PWS. So this was a randomized double-blind study, meaning that all of the participants were randomly assigned to receive either active carbetocin or an inactive placebo matching nasal spray, and neither the participants or their caregivers and parents or the study doctors or the sponsoring company knew about which treatment group the participants were assigned to. So in this study, 17 of the participants were randomly assigned to receive intranasal carbetocin, and 20 of the participants were randomly assigned to receive placebo. And this slide presents the safety results from the completed phase 2 study. It shows all the adverse events reported in participants receiving active carbetocin in the column to the left. You can see under carbetocin, and the adverse events reported in participants receiving placebo in the middle column under placebo. So in each column, the first number that you'll see shows the number of participants where each event was reported, and the number in parentheses show the percentage rates of each event as a percentage value. So overall, there were no events that were categorized as serious or severe in any of the participants receiving carbetocin. But there were a number of reported events that I can go over in this slide. The most commonly reported event in both groups was headache. As you can see, this occurred in about 30% of participants in the carbetocin group, as well as about 30% of participants in placebo group. Some other events reported in one participant each receiving carbetocin included one case of abdominal cramping, one case of conjunctivitis or a pink eye infection, one case of diarrhea, and one case of what's called dysgeusia, which is a fancy medical term for a sensation of an unusual taste or saying something tastes funny. one event of flushing, one event of trouble sleeping, and then one event each of a throat irritation or sneezing. So overall, each of these events was rated as mild in severity by the study doctors, and none of these events led to any participant discontinuing their treatment. So overall, we felt the safety results of this phase 2 study indicated that intranasal carbetocin appeared to be safe and well tolerated, and it's motivated continued investigation now of the longer-term safety and effectiveness in the current phase 3 Care-PWS study, which is now enrolling. Okay, thank you, Susan. So this slide presents the primary efficacy results from the phase 2 study. So trying to assess whether carbetocin was effective in helping to improve the participants' hyperphagia, the phase 2 study was using a questionnaire called the HPWS-Q-R. So it stands for Hyperphagia in PWS Questionnaire Responsiveness Scale. So this was an earlier version of another hyperphagia questionnaire called HQCT that's currently commonly used to assess the severity of hyperphagia and food-related symptoms in PWS clinical trials. So in this phase 2 study, caregivers were asked to rate the severity of hyperphagia symptoms in their child using this questionnaire at the pre-treatment baseline before initiation of the study, and then assess the change at study day 8, midway through the study, and then at the end of the study at study day 15. So the change in this hyperphagia questionnaire score for participants receiving carbetocin is shown by the orange bars, both at day 8 on the left and day 15 on the right. And then the change in score that was reported for participants receiving placebo is shown in the blue bars to the side. So as you can appreciate, both the carbetocin group and the placebo group both improved, but the carbetocin group actually experienced a significantly greater improvement in hyperphagia symptoms assessed using this scale. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So this slide shows some of the additional secondary endpoints that were used to test the effectiveness of carbetocin in this phase 2 study. So the PSI box, which stands for the Children's Yale Brown Obsessive Compulsive Scale, is a detailed interview-based assessment in which a clinician at the study site will interview each caregiver about the severity of obsessive and compulsive symptoms of the PWS participant in the study. So these could be both food and non-food related symptoms, things like hoarding behavior, skin picking, repetitive needs to ask or tell, a wide variety of obsessive and compulsive behaviors that can be common in PWS. So the results on this scale encouragingly showed a highly significant reduction in participants receiving carbetocin compared to placebo. If you look to the bottom row of this table, the HPWS-Q-RC is another version of the hyperphagia questionnaire I talked about in the previous slide. The difference there was that this version was completed by the clinician at the study site rather than the caregivers themselves. And in the second row, the Rice Profile Food Domain is another scale also assessing food-related behaviors, and so each of these scales also indicated a significant improvement in participants receiving carbetocin compared to placebo. And then lastly on this slide, the CGI-I is a more general rating scale that allows the study clinicians to rate their overall impressions of the overall improvement of PWS symptoms as a whole. And so this also indicated a significant improvement in the carbetocin group compared to placebo. So if you're interested in seeing more about this completed phase 2 study, the full results have recently been published last year, and the manuscript and detailed results are available at the website link shown below on this slide. So overall, although we agree more research still needs to be done, and we're moving on to do that phase 3 study now, we and the phase 2 study investigators strongly felt that these results were very encouraging and supportive of continuing to move on to a larger and longer phase 3 study, which can now more fully evaluate the long-term safety and effectiveness of carbetocin as a potential treatment for PWS. So this slide shows an overview of the design of the Care-PWS phase 3 study that's currently enrolling patients. This is also a randomized double-blind study, meaning that participants, again, are randomly assigned to treatment groups, and neither participants or caregivers or the study doctors will know which group people are assigned to. Um, this study has a design involving two different periods. So first, during an initial 8-week placebo-controlled periods, the participants could receive either placebo or one of two different dosage levels of the intranasal carbetocin. And then following that initial 8-week placebo-controlled period, anyone who is previously receiving placebo will be reassigned to receive active intranasal carbetocin at either one of the two dosage levels. So this means that all participants in this study will have opportunity to receive active carbetocin throughout the subsequent 56-week long-term follow-up period. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So the caregiver reported outcomes that will be monitored in this study to see whether carbetocin is effective in improving PWS symptoms include the hyperphagia questionnaire for clinical trials assessing hyperphagia, the PWS anxiety and distress questionnaire. This is something our CEO, Sarah Cotter, has worked closely with FPWR to develop to assess anxiety and distress in PWS patients. Then a caregiver global impression scale, which allows the caregivers to rate their impression of overall improvement in certain PWS symptoms. And then lastly, the food safe zone, a questionnaire which measures the kind of accommodations and food-related precautions that the parents and caregivers have had to implement for their loved one with PWS. Then two outcome measures that will be reported by the clinicians at the study site include that SIBOX interview assessing obsessive and compulsive symptoms that I mentioned earlier from the phase 2 study, and then also the clinical global impression scales reading their overall impression of improvement in PWS symptoms. In addition, safety will be continually assessed throughout the study by monitoring adverse events, standard panel of laboratory tests, electrocardiograms, and physical examinations by the study doctor. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So what would participation in this study look like? So the study would include a total of 10 study visits to the study site over a total period of 66 weeks of participation. So during that initial 8-week placebo-controlled period I talked about, there will be a total of 4 visits, one at screening, one at the baseline or initiation of the study medication, one at week 2, and one at week 8. After that 8-week placebo-controlled period, there will be that long-term follow-up period where everyone receives active carbetocin, and the visits during that period will gradually become less frequent, as you can see here, becoming every 3 months at the end of that long-term follow-up period. So at the study site, each study visit is estimated to take about 3 to 4 hours. This includes the questionnaires and safety assessments that I talked about earlier. Throughout the study medication will be given 3 times per day as a nasal spray before meals. Then there will be home shipments of the study medication sent to the caregivers throughout the study. And caregivers would be asked to fill out a daily study medication diary form just to document that the study medication is being given as intended. For children that are attending school or day programs throughout their participation, this is of course allowed, but we would need to arrange the ability to receive the lunchtime doses so the study site staff and the sponsor can help with discussions with schools to facilitate that lunchtime dosing. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so this slide summarizes some of the primary criteria for the PWS study. It's not a exhaustive or full list, so if you're interested in the study, contact one of the study sites and the study doctors can fully assess whether they think the potential participant is appropriate for enrollment. So the inclusion criteria include age 7 to 18 years old. So this is an inclusive range, meaning that anyone who has not yet turned 19 on the screening visit could be eligible. So if you're 18 years and 11 months when you go in for screening, then you wouldn't be excluded for that reason. People should have genetically confirmed PWS, should meet the criteria for what's called PWS nutritional phase 3, which would mean they have significant hyperphagia and rarely feel full, complete the informed consent process, discussing what would be involved in study participation with the study doctor. And the principal exclusion criteria include people who live in a group home. The reason for that is we need a caregiver who knows the participant very well and is able to report reliably on their PWS symptoms during each visit. Anyone who's had a new food-related intervention or restriction initiated within 1 month before screening for the study. Anyone who's been on unstable doses of other medications they're taking before entry into the study, and anyone who's participated in a different interventional treatment study in the 6 months prior to screening. So of note, we'd like to point out no inclusion or exclusion criteria specific to body weight or BMI are planned, and participants with diabetes also won't be excluded as long as the study doctor believes they're on a stable medication regimen and they're safe and appropriate to participate. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so to further summarize the Care-PWS study, it's a phase 3 randomized double-blind study that's designed to continue to evaluate the long-term efficacy, safety, and tolerability of the intranasal carbetocin. It will enroll approximately 175 participants with PWS who are aged 7 to 18. There's no restrictions on body weight or BMI. And then after an initial 8-week placebo-controlled period, all participants will be able to receive active carbetocin over the 56-week long-term follow-up period. The efficacy measures will assess change in hyperphagia, obsessive-compulsive symptoms, and anxiety, and will maintain an up-to-date list of participating sites in the United States and Canada on our website at levotx.com and also at the study page at clinicaltrials.gov. Go to the next slide. Okay, so here's a map of the currently planned Care-PWS study sites in the United States and Canada. We're planning to enroll participants at approximately 24 study sites throughout the US and Canada, showing the map on each slide. Not all of these sites are currently actively enrolling patients yet, but we will maintain that updated list of planned and currently active sites, including contact information of the study coordinators on clinicaltrials.gov and on our website at levotx.com. And I can also announce today for the first time that we are now in the initial stages of planning for study sites in Australia. So it will still take us some weeks to work out the arrangements for that, but we're excited to be able to start the study in that country as well. Go to the next slide. Okay, and this, I think, which is the final slide, lays out some plans for travel assistance for people interested in participating. So travel assistance will be provided in cases where a caregiver and participant need to travel to attend study visits. There'll be reimbursements for study-related travel expenses that can be received on study debit cards issued to each family participating. Caregivers will be reimbursed to cover all patient and caregiver meals, parking fees, and rental car fees associated with study participation, and personal vehicle mileage can also be reimbursed for those driving to a study site. If there's not a participating study site in your immediate area, or if you have a physician that you've been working with who's participating in the study that's located a fair distance from you, that's fine, and Levo can provide you with travel assistance throughout the study, and all study-related airfare and hotel costs can be paid for directly by a study travel agency. Okay, so I think that's the final slide we had. So Susan, we can pause to take questions from the audience.
Thank you so much, Davis. We are going to take questions from the audience. We will do our best to answer every question that is submitted to us. In order to submit a question, simply use your control panel. There's a chat box where you can type in your questions and submit them to us. And we'll, like I said, we'll try to get through all of the questions that are submitted. We do have a couple of questions in the queue, so we're going to go ahead and jump right in. Davis, the first question is, my child is in the normal range for weight and height. Can he or she still participate?
Okay, so yeah, the answer to that is yes. So we understand that people with PWS can have significant hyperphagia and behavioral symptoms without necessarily having weight gain, especially if their caregivers have made diligent accommodations. They may still have symptoms that need treatment. So because of this, There are no enrollment restrictions based on weight or the body mass index for the study.
If my child is on placebo, what will be in the nasal spray?
Okay, well, that's an interesting question. So actually, both the placebo solution and the active carbetocin solution that are being used in the phase 3 study will include the exact same set of inactive ingredients. So it's not just water or saline solution if you're receiving the placebo. So one example is that both the placebo solution and the carbetocin solution are each based on this very diluted solution of acetic acid, which is the same weakly acidic molecule that's in vinegar. It's really so dilute that it doesn't cause any noticeable smell or taste, but because of that, if you feel or experience any apparent sensation or effect after taking a dose of the study medication, that doesn't necessarily imply whether or not that dose of the medication was the active carbetocin or the placebo.
If someone was to participate in the study, how long will they have access to the drug?
Okay, so as we had referenced a little earlier, so following the initial 8-week placebo-controlled period, anyone previously receiving the placebo will be reassigned to receive active carbetocin during the 56-week long-term follow-up period. And in addition to that, if this current study is successful, we are hoping to start an additional, even longer-term rollover study, which would allow people who had participated in the current Care-PWS study to continue to receive carbetocin after the completion of this study if they would want to.
You mentioned in your previous slides that there are 2 different doses available in addition to the placebo. During the longer open access period, is there an opportunity to switch between the higher and lower dose if one is seen to be more or less effective?
Okay, well, that's a good question. So we're currently planning to evaluate 2 different doses in this study with the aim of seeing which of them seems to be more appropriate and safe and effective. But we do have an independent data safety monitoring board who will be independently reviewing data from the study as it becomes available. And if at some point during the study, if there's enough information to include that one of those doses is better, then they could give us advice that could enable us to roll over patients onto that recommended dose. We just don't have enough information quite yet what to know, and we're continuing to remain blinded since it's a blinded study. But we will have the opportunity to get advice from that independent data safety monitoring board to make that decision as we get more information.
Is there an opportunity for individuals whose loved ones are over the age of 18 to participate?
Okay, well, yeah, that's a good question. So not in the current study, with the exception of what I discussed, that it's actually on an inclusive age range. So if you're 18 and 11 months, you wouldn't be considered to have yet turned 19. You could still be eligible. The current study is enrolling people only up to that age. We're trying to maintain consistency with the study population that was examined in the phase 2 study, and so aren't deviating to a great extent from that age range yet. However, if the current phase 3 study is able to confirm that carbetocin is safe and effective in our current study population, we're hopeful that that might potentially be applicable to older patients as well.
You show that this study has been broken into 2 parts, a double-blind portion followed by an open label extension. Do you have to participate in the full 66 weeks, or can you elect to participate in just the shorter portion?
Well, we're asking for people to continue to participate in the full length of the study. The study visits do become more spaced out and less frequent during the long-term follow-up period, so we're hoping that will make continued participation less burdensome. And the reason for conducting a long-term study now is to continue to accumulate more information about the safety and effectiveness of continued long-term treatment, considering that the phase 2 study was so successful but only investigated 2 weeks. We're really wanting and needing to investigate and confirm whether it's a safe and effective long-term treatment. And we're hoping that it will be tolerated and effective over that long-term course.
On one of your first slides, you talked about some of the benefits of carbetocin, including behavior improvements and anxiety. Why does the participant need to have hyperphagia in order to participate?
Okay, well, so hyperphagia is one of our what's called the primary endpoint. So in order for regulators to assess approval of the drugs, you have to show something that a drug is effective on certain primary endpoints that you assess. And the hyperphagia scale was investigated in the phase 2 study and is also investigated in phase 3. So because the success or failure of this current study depends on whether or not it could show immeasurable improvements in hyperphagia symptoms compared to placebo, we would just need that study participants have enough of the severity of hyperphagia symptoms when entering the study, just in order to be able to accurately detect whether or not the study medication is having an effect on that. So it's very important for the study to be successful and hopefully result in the treatment becoming widely available to the PWS community. It's important for caregivers to be able to give accurate and honest answers about the symptom severity during screening and throughout participation in the study.
So how will I know if my child has enough hyperphagia to be eligible for this study?
Okay, so this study will enroll participants who have PWS nutritional phase 3. So this means in general that they have a fairly significant degree of hyperphagia, which is an unrelenting sense of hunger, that in general they may rarely feel full and likely have some significant difficulty being redirected away from seeking food or asking about food and food-related topics. But if you think that this might describe your child reasonably well, even if you have some uncertainty or if you're unsure about whether or not they might or might not be eligible, then please do contact one of our study sites to discuss screening, and they can ask you about these symptoms in a detailed way and make their determination about the study eligibility.
So I put up the map for everyone. Here's the clinical trial sites that are available in the US and Canada. Again, you have Australian sites that will be opening soon as well. Parents are asking me, when is my trial site opening? How can they stay best in the know of when their site's going to be available?
Mm-hmm. Well, probably the most immediate information should be available through our website. I think especially if you go to the clinicaltrials.gov link on the levotx.com website, it should always be kept updated as each site becomes active and able to enroll patients. That's probably the most immediate way to get updated information about what sites are currently enrolling.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to thank the team from Levo for joining us today and answering questions from our community members. If you're interested in learning more about this clinical trial or others, you'll find a directory of clinical trials at fpwr.org, which includes contact information for each trial site. You can reach out to the trial site nearest you to enroll or to ask any further questions you may have regarding participation. Clinical trial information can also be found at clinicaltrials.gov. We invite you to join us for future clinical trial webinars. Melendo's levolitide clinical trial is expected to open soon, and we will share information about that study on a webinar on April 16th. We also invite you to learn more about the mindfulness intervention study, which is aiming to improve temper outbursts using mindfulness techniques. You can learn more about this study on our May 6th webinar. Thank you again for joining us today. Please continue to spread the word about these trial opportunities so that we can enroll them as quickly as possible. Have a wonderful day.